many of you own a house?
Are you sure about that?
Because it might just be that your house owns itself. And this is just one of the stories that you can learn by reading our tests.
And that is because the tests, they can tell another story about your domain than what the domain experts can. And, well, you can see this property over here. We'll tell you more about this one further on during the talk. So, hang on.
My name is Anna, and I work as a functional architect.
My name is Mats. I work as tech lead.
And we, along with a whole bunch of other people, we create the case management system for the Norwegian courts.
Yeah, which is, as you might guess, it's a large project. It's been going in production for 16 years now. It's almost a monolith. It was a monolith. We're trying to split it currently. And of course, it's crucial to the society, because you need to have a functioning court system, right?
Yeah, no pressure at all. So, as you can imagine, it's complex and it's extensive, but still it doesn't have very many bugs. And it's been that way ever since the beginning, actually.
So, when we got into the project a couple of years ago, some years ago, well, the project had already been going for many years. And as you might expect, there were quite some established guidelines, quite some established, this is the way we do things, routines, and so on.
Yeah, and one of those guidelines was that everything that we delivered into production had to be tested by someone else. And what that meant is someone had to manually test it, because only through manual testing could we feel safe enough that we were delivering what we're supposed to.
Yeah, and of course, this is a complex system, and as it was a monolith, you can imagine that, well, one change in the code base over here could suddenly affect something here and some other code over here, and introduce a bug over here in something we thought was unrelated.
Yeah. And so every third month or so, each and every poor soul in the project would spend weeks and weeks doing manual click, click, click testing through the entire system, doing both regression testing and testing the new features we're making again for the umpteenth time. And that was really, really boring.
Yeah, and let's admit something for you today, is that we don't like testing.
Nope.
But of course, what we mean by saying that is that we don't like manual verification.
We find manual verification to be really boring. Sorry for all your test gurus out there. But opening your graphical client and clicking there and writing a number here and so on, it just gets really tedious. And if you have to follow detailed steps in a test description, that's even worse. Even the idea makes us just tired.
Yeah, but still, well, as a developer and now as tech lead, the one thing I really don't like is causing bugs for users in production. We want to create software that's great, software that solves the problems the users have, that makes it easier for them to do the job. So that's the reasoning behind why we did all this manual testing, is that we don't introduce bugs, which is, of course, fine.
Yeah. We don't think our users like bugs either, so it's just not us. And it's no fun delivering software that is laden with bugs. And like we said, bugs in a case management system for the courts, it can have really dire consequences. So we had to take testing seriously, whether we wanted to or not.
Yeah, so luckily we came out with a solution, though.
Yeah, use the computer instead. Because as humans, we have a flaw in our DNA when it comes to testing. Because we're creative and we're flexible and we're full of ideas as humans, but we're really bad at doing the exact same thing over and over and over again. And we're even worse at staying focused if we're bored.
Luckily, the computer is great at a couple of things, or quite many things, but especially a few things, and that is doing the same thing over and over again without changing anything. Like a computer doesn't have even the concept of being bored. It does what we as developers tell it to do, right? And so if we let the computer do all that, then we can spend more time doing more interesting things like exploratory testing or coding or speaking with users or any other useful things in a project.
Yeah, and luckily our finding is that most any test can be automated, except for exploratory testing, like Matt mentioned, and that's of course important. But by nature, it's hard to automate unless you're into AI or something like that.
Yeah. So Alberto is not here, is he? Good. Then we can show the next slide. Don't repeat yourself. It's an acronym that we, as a developer, it's one of the first things you learn during software engineering courses. Don't repeat yourself. Like, don't duplicate code. Don't write the same code over and over again. Which is a guideline that often makes sense when writing code. There are quite some interesting discussions to have on that as well, but that's a sidetrack or another talk. So, we're really up for discussion on like when should you duplicate code and when does it make sense and so on. But as a rule of thumb, you should avoid it, right? That kind of makes sense. But at some point, we figured out that okay, when we're writing code, we are trying to avoid duplication, trying to avoid repeating ourselves. But when we are testing, we are repeating ourselves all the time.
A lot. Yeah, and all of this led us into the world of automated testing, because it turns out that you can actually enjoy testing even though you don't like manual verification.
Yeah, and that leads us into the topic of why do we even write tests in the beginning, why do we test in general, not just write tests, but why do we test? And of course, we want to catch bugs before users catch them. That's a given one. But there's more to it than that. And we think that much of it is about trust. It's about building trust.
Yeah, we write tests to make our customers trust us.
But we also write tests to make our co-workers trust us.
And to be able to sleep at night, to trust ourselves.
And a lot of other reasons as well, so stay tuned.
So, since we have different purposes when we're writing tests, it goes without reason that you can't have one type of test that will fit all your needs. Sadly, there is no such thing as one test to rule them all.
Yeah, so if you want to frame that onto a question, the question would then be,
what story do you want to tell with your tests? And to what audience do you want to tell it?
Because it turns out that there are many stories that could be told about your domain, about our domain, about any domain. And there are many different listeners as well. And in the same way that when you go to speak to your manager, you speak with her in a different way than if you were to speak to a business expert or a fellow developer. Sorry, as a developer, I say fellow developers all the time, so for those of you who aren't developers, bear over with me. But you tell different stories to different people, right? You talk in different ways when you're talking to people with different background and different knowledge. And also, that's of course is partially because, well, these people care about different things. They care about different aspects, and as a consequence of that, they also care about different types of tests for your application. So let's head on to different types of tests.
Okay, so let's start with the bird's view, the value chain test. So who of you know about value chain tests? No one. Well, this can be fun then.
Yeah. So the short version, the very short version is that in a value chain test, what you do is you run through some kind of workflow, like a workflow from your domain. And at the end of it, you verify that, yeah, the state is what I expected it to be. Or like what the domain expert wanted it to be.
Yeah, and for your users, this is a way to show that you have understood the whole story from A to C.
Yeah. Oh, and we'll soon come to an example, so if it didn't make sense, hopefully it will when we show you an example. But what we have experienced while we're working with a system that you can name it legacy. Well, it is legacy. It's 16 years old. So, and what we found in our legacy system is that the production code is somewhat scattered around all over the code base. So it's not structured the way we was hoping it. Like we would ideally want it to be structured. Production code is scattered around. So the tests, they are the fastest way to see, okay, how should this application work and hang together in a way.
Yeah. And also, it's a great place for new project members to start because they can go there and easily get an understanding of how the system works, much faster than going into the production code. So let's look at an example. We don't want to be too morbid, but we think that at some point or another, everyone here has probably wondered what happens when you die. And luckily, we have the answer, and we even have tests to prove it.
Yeah, so we won't go into too much details.
Yeah, okay. So maybe we just know what happens when you die in the court system, but still, it's something. Okay, so what we're going to show you is the administrative bit of what happens in the court system when someone dies. And this is the value chain test for registering the person as dead. First, you create a case of death. Then you register the deceased. Then you register the heirs. Then you notify the National Registry of the death. And then you can make sure that the person is actually registered as dead.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that this is, well, in the case of natural death. Don't go out and kill someone, that would create another case. Don't do that in general. But so, from a test perspective, though, this test accomplishes at least two things. First one is quite technical, given one is that, well, you verify that the code runs without blowing up, like without throwing exceptions. And you also verify that, yeah, the person is actually registered as dead at the end. And yeah, we don't really, this is not a talk about tooling, so you can do this in like any talk you want. We have done it in Java because we are most familiar with Java in general. But you can do this in Java or C# or whatever, or you can also do it in tools like Cucumber Fitness or other tools you might want.
So one of the benefits of this is that the customer can look at it and they can feel safe that the case will work as planned. But did you notice another thing? From just a really quick glance, you have learned a lot about the flow of a case of death. And you've gained more understanding about how the domain works than if you'd spent hours trawling the production code.
Yeah, because if you deep dive into one of these methods that we just showed you, like register the case of death, that method might be complex and thorough in production code.
Yeah, and that brings us to another way that these value chain tests can help improve your system.
Yeah, and that is, well, as this is a DDD conference, I guess, or like conference mainly about, it's not a DDD conference, it's a conference on business software, which kind of related. What was my point? Yeah, okay, so these value chain tests, they speak to different audiences. Like, yeah, they can give me as a developer or other people in the development team insight into, okay, how is the business actually working, what are you actually doing, how is their workflow in the real day-to-day life, a bit like Marcelo just talked about in the previous talk here. But they also do communicate well with the domain experts, so that the domain experts can be sure that, yeah, he actually knows what he's talking about. Like, yeah, the developers understood what I was trying to communicate, so we agree on what the word should be like. But that's not really all there is to it. There's more to come.
Yeah, you can think of it as a way to domainify your code, at least when it comes to naming, because it's a lot easier to have good and clear naming when you're writing a new test than it would be to try to change all of your legacy code. And believe us, we've kind of tried. But the thing is, with very little effort, you've improved the readability of this particular part of the system by heaps and heaps.
Yeah, and another good thing is that, well, regardless of how good or bad or legacy or whatever your production code is, you can still use proper naming in your tests. You can use proper division of code, separation of concerns, all these things in your tests, and still gain some benefits from it, regardless of what your production code is like.
Yeah, and of course we recommend that in production code as well, but legacy system. So. Okay, so up until now, what we've shown you is the main path, or the happy path. And a typical idea that people tell us is that value chain tests are really good for documenting these kind of happy path scenarios.
Yeah, but we would argue that, yeah, that's cool, and that's good, but there's more to it than that, because in many domains, and at least in ours, we have, this is the main path, but in 50% of the scenarios, there's another path that happens like a backup path or number 2 path or whatever you want to name it. And important error paths where you can also use value chain tests.
Yeah, and the value chain tests can show and verify the diversity of the domain, which is equally important and also equally fun.
Yeah, because it turns out that domains may seem simple at first, and then they don't seem that simple anymore once we've been looking into it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's show you an example from a whole different context. This is a value chain test for when the court is obliged to let you know something. It might be that you're part in a case and that you've been summoned to a meeting, for instance.
Yeah, so what happens here, this is the main path. The court, they do write a letter to send you. They send it by mail. Then you answer that, yeah, I got this letter. So you reply and say, yeah, I got it. And then, well, then we should have registered in our system, yeah, you have confirmed that you got a letter.
Yeah, and if that doesn't succeed, they will try harder because they have to get to you. And we'll see that now.
Yeah, and this is why the court will do several attempts to contact you, because as normal citizens, what we do when the court sends us a letter says, confirm that you received this letter. Of course, you answer that, yeah, I got the letter, and then you move on.
That's what you think.
Yeah, that's what most of us hopefully will do. But if you don't answer, what happens then? Well, the court will write a letter. They will send the letter by mail. So far, similar with the previous one. But if you don't answer, the court will wait for 2 weeks. So this is Norway, so like the length may vary here in Germany, but still, the principles are probably the same. So the court waits for 2 weeks so that you get the time to answer. And if you haven't answered within the 2 weeks, they send the police to your door to give you the letter in person. And then they can be sure that, yeah, you have received a letter.
Yep. And you might think that this never happens, right? But it does, quite a lot actually. Because if you've been filed bankrupt or you're a part in a criminal case, you might not want the courts to get to you. So this and similar scenarios happens a lot more than you'd think.
Yeah, and there are more paths as well. So like if the police can't find you, then then they're stepping it up another level. But if you aren't interested in details on this, talk to us afterwards.
Just know you can't escape the courts.
We're not encouraging that either.
No.
All right, so let's head on to the quirks of the domain.
Yeah, because that's a whole different type of test, actually. And these are the tests that you write mainly for your own sanity, because these are the tests that will allow you to sleep at night, knowing that no one else goes and removes some vital piece of code that you wrote just because they don't understand it.
And this is also where you can ask the question that, yeah, this is a quirk, or is it a quirk, or is it a data error? And yeah, that's interesting and important to find out, but regardless, you have to take care of it so that it doesn't bring down your system.
Yeah, and the thing is, you can't trust anyone else, or yourself for that matter, to model the domain in code as it is in real life. So there will be mismatches between reality and your code.
So in the beginning, we spoke about the host that outs itself. You remember? Yeah, good. So it turns out that this property in Norway took down the entire court management system for a day.
Very fun day at work.
Yeah, we were a bit stressed for a couple of hours there, because we didn't imagine at all that, a host that owns itself can take down the system. We can, no one even thought about that would be possible. But it did, and it did because, well, we have code that finds the owner of a house. And, well, the owner of this house is this house, and this house, and you get going, right? And then you run out of memory, and then everything crashes, and then you're in trouble. That happens to us.
Yeah.
So now we have tests that checks for houses that owns themselves, and we have production code that explicitly checks that, okay, if this property owns itself, do some special handling.
Yeah, and this is where your continuously running tests will knock the heck out of any kind of stale documentation. Because there's no better way to document these obscure scenarios than through running tests. This just screams out at you long before you've even launched something in production, because you know that you don't want to change this unless you really, really know what you're doing.
Yeah, and if you imagine that you're a developer, you're a bit eager, so you want to clean up code, and you think that, oh, this code can never happen because it won't happen that houses own themselves. And then you break this test, and then you realize that, oops, I was a bit too eager here. No, I'm introducing a problem. So you will stop long before you're running into trouble.
So here's another example that suddenly occurred to us. Luckily, it didn't take down the server this time. But it turns out houses don't actually need to have an owner at all.
Yeah, and this brings up an interesting question like, okay, but what do you do when this changes? Well, you handle it. It's like, well, if someone suddenly buys this house, then okay, we update it, or we find another one, or we change the test, or then we handle it, if that happens. But then again, if you want to buy this house that no one owns, who do you buy it from?
Okay, so we've talked a lot about domain, and maybe we should start talking a little bit about what we think a domain is.
Yeah, and as I guess many of you know, defining what a domain is hard. But so we instead of trying to find like a perfect definition, we instead thought that, okay, what would the useful definition be for us? And well, we found out that whatever the domain expert cares about, that's the domain.
Yeah, and hopefully you all know who your business domain experts are. But have you ever considered that your colleagues are domain experts as well?
Because we believe that there are at least two domains in any code base, in your code, which is the business one, of course. For us, it's the codes. But there's also a separate domain, a technical domain. Because we are used of thinking of the domain as something that the business owns.
Yeah, and like we said, for us, our domain is the court systems, and you, of course, have your own domains.
Yeah. However, we believe that technology and code and all the things around it, it's a domain in and by itself. So everything concerning things like transactions, databases, persistence, code duplication, all the other technical stuff are in the technical domain. And we believe that you make your life so much easier if you are able to separate the technical domain from the business domain, so that you separate whatever is difficult and hard and challenging in the business domain from whatever is hard technically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, the domain experts are different as well, because, well, of course, your business domain experts are your business domain experts.
Users.
Yeah, but in the technological domain, the domain experts are the developers, the operations folks, the technical testers.
Yeah, so we kind of think of the technical domain as what the user doesn't care about. Because as long as the user cares, it's in the business domain, and then you should use the user's natural language. Or you should at least have a very, very good reason not to use their language. So in our project, we actually use two different languages for the different domains. We use Norwegian for the business terms, and we use English for the technical domain. And that kind of makes sense because a lot of the technical literature is in English, of course. But on the business side, all of our users speak Norwegian.
And of course, the division between, okay, this is technical, or like, is this word or sentence technical or is it business? It's not always that clear, right? There might be some gray areas and so on. And some words are used in both, and that's okay. But you don't have to have perfect division, so it's not struggle for perfection here, but you can perfectly fine have, as we have, many method names with a mix of Norwegian words and English words. So they read quite strange if you read them. But that problem gets a lot smaller if you are able to separate, okay, this is business code, this is technical code. So let's show you some examples.
Yeah. Here's an example of a mixed name with a little bit of Norwegian, a little bit of English. And this is always one of the first things that new developers notice and comment on when they see our code base. And it's really easy to laugh about because, yeah, it does look funny. It does.
Yeah. And as with everything else, it's a trade-off, right? But I'm so ever grateful for whenever I'm writing code and that I don't have to translate the different terms from the court system into English. I have enough struggle trying to figure out what they are in Norwegian and what they mean in Norwegian. So if I'm trying to translate it to another language as well, then it gets even worse. But on the other hand, the technical code, the technical difficult stuff, is typically, well, the code examples are in English, the documentation typically in English, everything regarding it is in English, the patterns are in English, so that makes it lots easier to do it in English. So like what we're trying to do in general is to minimize how much translation we have to do.
So is this just us, or do any of you guys do this as well? Oh, cool.
Quite a bit. Cool. So from technical to technical, let's move on to technical details, which is another set of tests.
Yeah. And so far, all of our test examples have been in a business-oriented language because the domain experts, users, should understand them. But now that we're moving into the technical domain, the technical tests should, of course, have technical names because they're in the technical domain and they're speaking to the technical domain experts.
Yeah, and these are the types of tests that will make your coworkers trust you that you have done your job right.
So here are a couple of test classes. And in the first two, your business experts can relax because they know that you have tests to ensure that you can search for and register houses.
Yeah, and the last test class here, well, your coworkers can ensure that, yeah, you have tests which covers your technical details.
Yeah, and your users don't need to understand that because they don't need to understand the technical aspects. That's what we are for.
Yeah, but of course the developers should know about the facade pattern, for instance. And that's part of the last test here. Of course, this division is easier to make if you have separated, like if your code base adheres to the single responsibility principle and other good design principles. But regardless of that, you can still make, of course you can, but make different tests for one single production class. So some real examples from our code base on technical tests.
Yeah, and these are perfectly legitimate technical tests, and no business domain expert would ever care about this.
Yeah, but your coworkers or like your fellow developers, will be happy if they know that, yeah, all the database scripts can actually run, or like, yeah, our dependency injection framework can actually handle, or like the persistence layer can actually handle and persist our classes. Yeah, that's good. I hope they can, right? And they would care a lot.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the technical details, but of course there are details also in the business domain. And so we'll take a look at some examples from that as well. And these are the kind of tests that are of great interest to your domain experts. And of course, they should use a business-oriented language so that your users can understand what you're actually testing.
Yeah, and as we already discussed, these tests are typically in Norwegian. So if you don't understand the name on the front here, on the top here, that's because it's in Norwegian. But we aim to make these tests readable and understandable for our users. Sometimes we succeed. And, well, just not a bold statement. It's like we think that your tests, they are as important as the production code, and you should treat them as such. It boils down to one single question, like, okay, if you don't even know that your code works, what is it even worth then? Why should the users trust you?
Yeah, and we think that the main purpose of production code is solving problems, but the test code, they visualize problems.
Yeah, so they easily said serve different purposes.
Yeah, and also, how else would you know that a self-owning property can take down the entire system if you don't have a test for it?
You can, of course, try it in production. Wouldn't recommend that.
Nope, not so fun.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about that your tests have more functions than just verifying that your code does what you think it does. Your tests can do a lot of other stuff too.
Yeah, for instance, well, there are certain things many developers aren't that great at and don't really like doing. One of them is writing documentation.
Yep.
But luckily, if you write great tests, they can serve as documentation for your domain and for your code as well. And for those of you who were at the previous talk with Marcelo, he had some great examples on that. And that's exactly what we are advocating here.
Yeah, and tests can also be a readable story of your domain to show how it works.
Yeah, and they, of course, the tests are a safety net against regressions later on. Because, like, whenever I'm using software myself, I can understand that, of course, there are bugs, because I know I introduce bugs myself. I know it's hard to avoid them at all. So we're like, yeah, if the software I'm using has bugs, it's fine. But if I find a bug, and then in the next version they fix it, and then 2 versions later the bug is back again, then I'm not happy at all.
Yeah, that's horrible. We've been there too. So, and an important thing about tests is that it's a great way to shorten those horrible system test phases that we were talking about in the beginning, where you had to do a lot of manual testing.
Yeah. So that was a bit about the different types of tests. So let's give you some advice of mistakes, or not mistakes, things we have learned, to say it another way.
Okay, so a quick question. How many of you have a perfect memory? No.
The guy in the corner there. All right.
We'll talk to you afterwards.
So that means that the one thing you can be certain about when you're coming back to the code you wrote earlier is that you will have forgotten some of the nuances about it. If you come back to it like tomorrow, or in 1 week, or in 2 months, or 3 years, you will have forgotten some of or all of the nuances of the code. And that's in the lucky case where you who wrote the code are the one coming back to see it. But like rarely you work alone in a team. You typically have some fellow developers with you, and of course when they see the code, they don't know what you've been thinking, unless you do things like mob programming and pair programming and so on. But that's a different story.
Yeah, because the one thing you're certain of is that someone will come back to your code at some point, whether it be in 5 days or 3 months or wherever. So you don't want it to be a horror story for whoever comes and sees the code.
Yeah, and that developer that comes in 5 years comes back to see your code. She will be so perfectly happy if you can provide her with good tests about the code, which tells, okay, what is this supposed to do and why does it do it? Because whenever you're writing code, whenever you're writing software code, production code tests, you are telling the story of something to someone.
So, okay, what should you think about when you're naming your tests?
Or what should you avoid? Like, how do you know if your test name is not good enough.
Yeah, well, if you show it to a domain experts and they don't understand what the test does, then it doesn't have the right name, period.
Yeah. So some of the good names we have created, I think, they are readable for the domain experts.
Yeah, and if this were wrong, then the domain expert would immediately shout out, "No, it's not 4 weeks, it's 5." And we'd know.
Yeah, we would know immediately. The feedback loop is very short.
Yeah.
Okay, so another one.
Yeah, and this is an example that not all test names need to be very precise, but there should be a statement that your domain expert can agree or disagree on.
And this is, well, the name of the test on top here, except for the properties part, this is something a domain expert actually told me when we sat and discussed, like, okay, how is this thing with namsman going to behave in this setting? And she said, well, it mainly follows the same rules as. Cool. I write that down.
Yeah, and that's really a good rule of thumb when naming your code in general. Just write what the domain expert says, and you have a very good starting point, at least.
Yeah, which leads us on to, but okay, hopefully your domain experts tell you things that are not lies.
Yeah.
But don't tell lies in your tests.
No, but it's kind of easy to do, though, if you're not careful when writing your tests. Remember this test that we looked at earlier?
So this test is probably right when you write it down, right? Whenever at the implementation point, the deadline is actually 4 weeks. But okay, then while we realized that, oh no, we replaced physical mail by using electronic communication, so you don't have to wait for 4 weeks anymore, so now the deadline should be 3 weeks. What now?
Yeah, well, since the test code is equally important to your production code, you have to make sure that you update both of them. Because tests are only working documentation as long as they're right. So you have to update them when the world changes. Because you don't want your test to lie about your domain. That's just awful.
And this is one thing that the computer can't really do for us. So we need to know what we're doing.
Yeah, and since this is one of the areas where we excel over computers, then it's well worth putting some extra effort into it.
Yeah, and keeping on to don't tell lies.
Another way you don't want to lie is by using real mocks.
That means whenever you write unit tests, use sensible names for variables, use sensible dates whenever you have a date, sensible default values. Yes, and even though it's just a mock, use sensible values.
And unfortunately, we've seen too many people use totally meaningless names and types because it's just a mock, so it doesn't really matter, right?
Yeah. Look, I can admit it, I've done it myself. I think I've stopped doing it now.
I hope.
Yeah. No, but it does really matter. It really does matter.
Yeah, it matters because of...
Yeah, and it matters. Why does it matter? Yeah, it matters because whenever we are working together on a project, we are collaborating, we are working together. Hopefully we have the same mental model of what the domain is like and how we should represent it. And like when we speak the same language and so on, so we have a shared mental model. And if we introduce like stupid mocks, then we break that model apart a bit.
Yeah, and also these kind of bad naming tends to spread out, and that makes it a hinder for training and learning when you have bad names in your tests.
Yeah, and if you show the tests to your domain experts, and like, well, you have use a date, for instance, that's completely out of sense. You create a date that like 100 years ago or like 200 years into the future. That will upset the domain experts and steal all of their focus.
Yep. Rubbish data and names takes away a lot of attention. Believe us, we've tried this.
Yeah, and it also takes away one of the most important things with tests is trust, as we've spoken a bit about. Like whenever you use nonsensible names, you break down a little bit of the trust in the tests as documentation and as a story as well. And then you lose the great opportunity of using your tests as documentation. So here are some mocks from one of our tests, which might mean absolutely nothing to you. That's fine. You are not our domain experts.
But to our domain experts, AL, JS, and SP are different type of lay judges, and so they appear in different types of cases and have different responsibilities.
Yeah, and meddommer is lay judge in Norwegian, and type is type. And you can see that, yeah, all of these have the type, like the data type of code, which I'd ideally have changed, but it's legacy code, so you can't do it all.
Sadly. Okay, so here is an example of what not to do if you're in the business domain.
Yeah, because here's like list, set, date, yeah, whatever. But luckily, this test is from our technical domain. And yeah, we might perfectly find this guess if the naming is good enough for a technical test. But on the other hand, what we're trying to test here is a method, like how does our code behave if we give it a list or a set, or how does it behave if we give it the date? So like the thing we care about is what type it is, not really what's inside it. That's for another test class. So we believe that here it might even be distracting to use other names, proper in a way names.
Yeah, and this is a great example of something that works well in one domain. This is the technical, would not work well in the business domain. Because if this were a business domain test, then this naming would not be so good. Because none of these names are plain wrong, but they're not very meaningful or useful or something for the domain experts. So for a business test, this naming wouldn't be good. And unfortunately, we've seen too many tests that are like this also in the business domain.
And there is a connection to this one. Copy-pasting might sometimes be useful, but it's a fallacy as well. Like, if you copy-paste tests, they typically end up being misleading or plain wrong, or just so general that it could be anything, like actor does something in a case. Yeah, that kind of tests.
But believe it or not, there is a huge difference between a civil case and a criminal case, for instance. And if you have to be a part in one of them, try and choose a civil case. Criminal is bad. Anyway, so a test that is great for one of these cases might not automatically be correct for the other.
And then you might say, but, well, why don't you make civil case and criminal case different data types? Well, you should do if you can, or like that's a good idea. So like if you have a better type system, so that there are several talks on domain modeling and functional languages and so on at the conference. So attend those and learn more about it. We're just gonna throw it out as an idea. Like if you have more proper typing in your code, that limits the amount of things you can do wrong. Like if civil case and criminal case are two different types, then you can't mix them up with too lazy copy pasting. It's like there are certain tests that you won't even be able to write anymore because the situation can't happen because the compiler stops you.
And that would be great, but sadly, again, legacy systems, so we don't have that.
Yet.
No, not yet. Getting there, maybe. So anyway, we've been experimenting with a few things, and something that we want to try, but haven't done much of yet, is mob testing.
Yeah, and we mention that here because we believe that when you start to use proper good names in your tests, there's a whole new world of opportunities that show up.
Yeah, and one of the things that we want to experiment more with is involving more people when writing tests. Because at the moment, it's mainly our developers that are solely responsible for writing tests. But we plan to involve more people like the business and so on more heavily, so we can get better testing.
So how many of you know a bit about mob testing already? Couple. How about mob programming? Some more people, okay. So easily put, I think we can say that, well, what about pair programming? most people. So like mob programming is pair programming with more people, easily said. Like several people writing code on a single on the same screen, like say in the same. Several people standing around the common computer writing code, easily put. Not true, but not that misleading neither. And mob testing is when you do that with tests, you can say.
And of course, that only makes sense if the naming is good enough for business to read the test, because otherwise they can't contribute in a mob testing environment.
So our hope, or like what we believe, is that mob testing can be and should be useful for the entire team, so that not only developers work together, developers and testers, but also domain experts and other like functional architects, test leads, other people from different parts of, like all the people in your team, easily said. Yeah. Even those that aren't fluent in programming.
And we hope that this can help us do less double testing, because everyone knows exactly what is covered by automated testing. And so they don't feel the need to do the exact same thing manually. So we hope to gain less manual verification by doing this. And still have the same level of confidence so that everyone is still happy.
And also it's the question of, like the ever difficult question in teamwork and programming is like, how do we assure that everyone is on the same level? How are we sure that their collective ownership of the code base, that people know the same things? And we believe that mob testing can help a lot on that.
Yeah, and we also think it can be a great way of catching bugs before they even happen, just because more people look at the code and the tests and evaluate it. So we know more, we have more insight from more people.
And of course, you also gain the benefits of like there are more people, more eyes on the code, test code as you write it. So it's also kind of a continuous code review, we believe. So we're looking forward to trying this out. And if any of you have an experience with mob testing, we'd love to hear about it. So please reach out to us afterwards if so. That's about, oh yeah, I guess we should say that as well. Feel free to contact us during the conference if you have questions or follow up or agree or disagree with us or something. We'd love to discuss more.
Yep.
And with that, let's go into a wrap up. Long story short, we've been talking for like 45 minutes now. What have we been trying to tell you? Well, one important thing is that we believe that it's a good idea to take your domain with you into your tests.
Yeah, and tests are a great way to help domainify your non-DDD legacy code.
Yeah, and do acknowledge that technical domain is a domain in and of itself and should be treated as such separately from the business domain.
Yeah, and also tests provide a different kind of value than production code does, but they're equally important.
And we believe that tests are the best way you can document your domain.
And the most important thing of all, go home and make sure that you actually own your own house, because it might just be that your house owns itself.
Thank you.